Today, we're going to talk about 10 mistakes that companies make with AI that set them up for failure. And these are very pernicious, right? Because these are things that don't necessarily cause immediate failure, right? But we've talked before about compounding and how if you make these mistakes, they can set the stage that over time, you're very likely to lead to failure. So that's the topic of today's discussion. But before we dive into that, I want to talk a little bit of context to sort of set the stage of like, why does this matter? So Raj, if you could just tell us like, why does this matter? Like, what is it about AI that do people even need to take any action on it?
It's a great question. I think when you think about how companies change themselves, right, there are two different categories largely. There are big initiatives that you do to transform a specific part of your organization. So it might be you're putting in Salesforce or SAP or building a building where you know what the end state is going to be. And it's a matter of just executing, managing it to get there, right? Project management is key there. Then there's another class of problems, which is where the outcomes are not as clear. The things are continuously changing. The customer demands are changing over time, and you have to adapt quickly to that. Used to be that 90% of everything that companies did was sat in this big bucket of big capital projects, and 10% sat in the let's innovate and let's do things that are continuously changing. That has moved over time more to a 50-50 model, and maybe even more in the let's do things that need to continually change where we don't know what the outcome is going to be. And that's where the companies have run into issues. That's where these 10 key mistakes come from, is that we're still thinking in the old way, but we're trying to execute in a world that's behaving in the new way.
Got it. Okay. And so if we talk about what we're saying is that we're moving into more of an innovation versus execution, right? If in the past 90% of it was just you had to do a good job at execution, and now you need to do a good job at innovation.
And think about why, right? You think about the technologies and what they're driving is a whole change in how the consumer behavior has how the consumer expectations have been set, and that translates to whether they're a business customer or a consumer as well. They expect things that are very different than what they expected 10 years ago,
All
and
right.
with
So is
AI,
this
that's just changing even more.
so is this an emergency? Is this urgent that we need to act on this right away and change everything overnight?
It's a good point. If you're a taxi cab company, then probably, or if you're, Blockbusters or Borders, probably. But most companies are not in that state. So you have time. And what will happen is if you rush into this without taking care of these 10 things, we can actually predict that the stats can predict what the level of failure is going to be on how well you've done across these 10 things before you moved into this transformation. But if you take a step back and spend some time putting these 10 practices in place and getting these 10 patterns in your organization changed to the new way of doing work, and it doesn't require a huge change, it's just some small pivots that need to be made, then you can practically guarantee success. So this is what the stats lay out from a digital transformation, from a robotics, from back in the web days, all of these different technology inflection points that have come our way.
Yeah, so I think there's two great points that come out of this, right? And maybe the right way to frame this is, remember Stephen Covey talked about importance versus urgency, right? So this is very important more than it's urgent. And I think the second insight that's really interesting is that this is not the first time that we've had something to deal with that was important versus urgent, right? And something that felt very urgent as well. So every technology wave that's come in the past has also felt very urgent, like the IT revolution of the 80s and 90s, the web revolution of the 90s and 2000s, right? Web 2.0, like all of these things feel like urgency when they hit you. But if you step back and look at what companies succeeded, they took kind of an important step-by-step methodical approach to it, right? They didn't just act.
That's right. I think that's the key, is that the DNA exists inside of the company to make this change happen. And if you actually don't take advantage of that DNA and put these 10 things in place, and you try to go against the DNA of the company, that's when failure happens. And the way the executives tell me they feel this is, I'll give you an example. We kicked off 50 agile teams across the company, and it was great. People are working in agile ways and they're doing digital initiatives. But what keeps me up at night is, what the heck are these teams working on? How are they prioritizing these things? When do I get deliverables? I'm not seeing any project plans of when I'm going to get deliverables, because it's all very iterative. Those are the types of gut feelings that you have that tell you that something is wrong in terms of how the pattern is being executed. And your instinct on how to run a business is right. It's just you need to map the new ways of doing things with the ways that have always worked, that overlay that, so you can manage that effectively.
Yeah, so I think there's a few things to sort of summarize here. So your business will be reinvented, but not overnight. It's going to happen over the next few years. So your space is going to be reinvented over the next few years. So you need to figure out how to very methodically reinvent yourself. That's sort of the first point. The second thing, if we think about like, okay, the forces, when you look out into the marketplace, what are the other forces that are going to create either signal or noise to help direct this, right? So if we think about, your competitors are going to be reinventing themselves as well. So you need to be thinking about that. This is not a static thing where you can sort of sit still and do nothing. Second of all, there are going to be upstarts that come in, digital born companies that have potentially tons of VC money thrown at them to immediately just on a dime disrupt your state, your company overnight and change everything. And right, I think Raj, to your point, like sometimes that happens, right? So in spaces like Uber, where there's tons of like non-innovation stacked up, okay, fine, that happens. But in the most cases, if your response is to take massive action in response to one of these heavily funded upstarts, you can get yourself into a lot of trouble.
Yeah. And it doesn't have to be gut wrenching and difficult to solve the problem, right? The good news is that the companies who have succeeded and are succeeding, they don't do anything revolutionary, right? Unlike the transformation story that all the books, the consultants, and the talking heads would have us believe, these companies simply execute based on solid, time-tested management principles, right? And they just add this new iterative, customer-obsessed lens that helps them get through this process. That's the key. And we'll go through the 10. Maybe we should dive into the kind of the categories.
Yeah, so I think, without further ado, let's dive in. So number one, lack of clear decision making and accountability around AI. So what does this mean?
So um, it's all about decision rights and accountability. So in this fast-paced model, today what happens is people are unclear of what decisions they should retain and what decisions they should push down into the organization that's executing. And it's not an easy task to make that call, because typically companies have either been completely command and control with limited frontline decision making, or they've tried to be this agile and push everything down and they feel like they've lost control. So the way to think about decision rights and accountability is, first, decision rights. The way I like to think about it is one-way and two-way doors, right? Anything that's a two-way door, that if a decision gets made, you can dial it back and you can reverse it. Those types of decisions should be pushed down to the organization. And then there are one-way doors that, man, if you cross that door, if you go through that door, you can't come back in. Those should be retained with the management team. And then what you have to do with those decisions that you've put out into the organization is that you have to set up a set of metrics and instrument that so that you can manage what the outcome of those decisions are. Let the people make mistakes, but know that those mistakes were made and correct them quickly. So I think that's the key is how do you actually break that decision rights component into what can be pushed down and what can be retained.
No, this makes sense, right? And this kind of leads us to number two as well, because if you don't really know what the scoreboard looks like or what game you're playing, you're going to have a lot of trouble, right? So number two is inadequate measurement and control mechanisms. So how does that play out with respect to AI?
It's it's the it's the tale as old as time, right? We don't have data. We don't know what's going on in the organization. We get reports every quarter or every month rather than every day. So this is where a little bit of a change needs to happen in that you need to create these top of house metrics or OKRs or whatever it is called. And then those metrics need to be cascaded down into the organization at the level where the decisions are being made. And then you define and install controls that enable the organization to either expand or stop or pivot based on whether or not you're hitting the predetermined goals. And that cascading metric structure has to basically, at the end of the day, the person who's making the decision has to understand how that decision is rolling all the way up to the top of the house. And once you have that, then you actually instrumented the organization and you're getting feedback, not in real time necessarily, but getting feedback on a very regular basis that you can make decisions about what to do, whether to expand something, whether to pivot something, or whether to stop something.
So what's interesting is there sounds to be like a real dynamic nature to this, right? And so I'd said like, the first thing is we need to be able to see the scoreboard to know what game we're playing and how we're doing. But it sounds like part of this process is also figuring out what game we're playing as we go. So how do you instrument as you go, and how do you update that instrumentation as you go down this path?
It's really, I think, very straightforward if you look at it from a cascading standpoint. So at the top of the house, when you know what the metrics are that you have to achieve, and they're not necessarily iterative metrics, right? There's a certain amount of customer growth, revenue growth, earnings, cost reduction, those types of metrics. If you've laid out the strategy to where you've pushed the decisions down and you've been able to instrument in a cascading way how those translate into daily, weekly metrics for your teams, then you just add those things back up, right? So that's how you sort of instrument the organization versus trying to rely on backwards looking reports that are not necessarily tying the goals of the management down into the frontline goals so that every frontline person doesn't know what whatever contribution they've made that day actually adds up to some number up top that is required for the company to be successful.
Yeah, it
And
makes
then the
sense.
flip
So
side of that is aligning the incentives to those metrics, right?
yeah, so it sounds like there's an art and a science to this, right? And there's also some of this which needs to be the same as the scoreboard is the same scoreboard to some degree, part of it, right? And then part of it is new instrumentation, which is we're trying to dynamically discover new proxies for getting us the same scores that we used to get in the past. It's not like everything's off the table and everything's new. So it's figuring out that what's the same and then what's dynamic as we go.
And there might be a few OKRs that you add that were not necessarily top of mind, 5 years ago or 10 years ago, but you need to add them today, which is how quickly am I executing on customer requests, right? So it's different from customer satisfaction. It's how quickly am I responding to the change in a customer behavior. That might be a metric that today is relevant that 10 years ago was not relevant.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point when you're sort of saying that the game has changed because of AI and technology. A lot of this changes expectations that customers have. And like if you look at like what Amazon does, if I I click something on Prime and it shows up 20 minutes later. That sets a very different expectation for a customer than 20 years ago. And it's like, if it shows up in a week or two, then, allow 4 to 6 weeks for delivery. So you have to be cognizant of how the world has already changed when you're setting your metrics going into this.
Right. That's exactly right. And
Right.
then, and I think that the key then is that leads us into the next big mistake, um, which is how do you make all this work right in your organization?
Yeah. And so we'll call that poor change management and adoption.
Yeah. So um, as we talked about last time, the way that people who are successful structure this is they set a vision at the top of the house that includes what are the economic values, but how is the company going to change and what's the vision look like? Then they build that coalition that's cross-functional, multi-executive coalition that's bought into the vision that's going to drive this into the organization. And then we talked about the three pillars that we're kind of structuring today. The first that we're talking about now is how does this governance and leadership work? Um, so change management is all about change leadership, right? So how do you actually ensure buy-in into your people that this is the right way to go? This is the right thing for the customer. And then second is how do you actually mobilize that change? And the most important thing that people do is when they're successful is they mobilize that change and they remove obstacles,
Yeah.
right? Where they're not successful is let's go hire a chief digital officer. Great. We hired a chief digital officer or a chief AI officer. It's now taken care of. That's not how this works. That person is doomed to fail. So I think the first thing is kind of mobilizing that change, removing the obstacles. The second thing is how do you build momentum? How do you get these small wins in the context of the broader picture? Get these small wins, declare victory, celebrate, but realize that, you know what, there's still a lot to do. So don't just say mission accomplished and move on. Definitely celebrate the small wins to create that momentum. Show the organization what it feels like in the context of the broader scope that you're going after, but then move into installing the right capabilities in the organization. So, do you have the right human resources capabilities in the organization to incent and reward the people who are behaving in a certain way? Do you have the right set of technology capabilities to back up what your people are trying to do? If somebody has an issue or a challenge, do they feel comfortable raising their hands? Do they know who to go talk to say this is wrong? You know, the O-ring seal is probably going to fail.
Yeah.
You have no the challenge is people declare the victory. So the first challenge is they hire the guy or the gal and move on. The second challenge is even if they don't do that and they get some quick wins, they declare victory and they move on. But the key thing is going to be once you've done those two things, is to establish the systems and the capabilities that will enable people to be successful in this model at scale.
Yeah, and to prove it, and to basically create, like, there's going to be beliefs. When you try to do something bold like this, beliefs are going to form really quickly. And the two paths that those beliefs can take is, number one, they're just saying that, but if I stick my neck out, I'm going to get my head chopped off if I make a mistake. That's
Right.
really bad, right? The other possible road is, imagine that you've got all this executive leadership on board. You've made a big deal about we're making this change, we're doing this reinvention, we're all behind it. And then you celebrate a win and you really highlight it and you make it clear that, hey, this is a big deal and we're really, really excited about it. That starts shifting the beliefs that, okay, this is different. This is actually the change happens from the belief out. And at the very lowest levels within the organization, people start seeing that, oh, they're not just saying that this is a priority. When someone takes a risk and when they start making progress, that's being celebrated.
It's
That's what
huge.
changes. Right.
It's huge. That recognition is huge. And there will always be people who say, this is not for me. And I've had this, and many clients have had this, is some group of people will say, I believe this is going to change the company. And I
Mhm.
believe it's going to change it for the good for the customer, but it's not for me. I'll take a package or I'll retire. There's there's a small group of people who will do that. And that's great. That's perfect for them. But then the other people who still have their whole career ahead of them in the company, getting them engaged and bought in and driving this forward, and then giving them the capability, that foundational set of capabilities is so important, because if they have to go bash their head against the wall every time they want to do something, they're just going to stop doing it after a
Mistake,
little
yeah.
while. So
Yeah, yeah.
let's
So
smooth those things out.
okay, so this is great. So I think the first three mistakes are really, if we talk about these around governance and leadership and kind of setting the stage, really it's around beliefs in the organization. And we say we're going to reinvent ourselves around AI. And now when that belief starts becoming true, the amount of energy that you're going to unlock is massive. When people see that, say, to your point, there's people that make this decision in their mind that, okay, yeah, I see this as a way to go, but I'm just going to kind of either hang out in peace over here, or I'm going to leave. And then there's other people that say, this is the opportunity I've been waiting for to make my move.
Right.
I've been banging the drum that, hey, we need to change. We need to become world class. We need to, and wow, the management leadership is actually pushing this. And now I can get on board. So now
Right.
we've established that if you have not unlocked this energy, do not go to the next few. But okay, if you're committing to this,
It's
right?
true, because
Right.
guess what happens, right? There's those two groups of people that you just described. If you create an aura of yes, this is going to succeed, look at the quick wins, the management is behind it, and it's worth massive value for the company and for the people in the company. If you haven't done that, then there's this just layer of cynicism among the people who don't want to change, right? They just sit back and keep doing what they were doing. And the people that you could have inspired, they also sit back and just do what they would have kept doing,
Yeah.
saying, this too shall pass,
So the good
right?
news
They
is,
can't get energized and drive the change.
so the good news is if you fail at these first three, you don't have to hear the rest of these because you've already lost. um,
Exactly.
But
Exactly.
let's take the alternate path. So, okay, you get this right, you get the right foundation of governance and leadership in place. Now it comes down to number four. Now we're getting to the okay, now how do I do it? What sort of activities, right? So number four is taking a standard project-based approach to AI. Why is that such a bad thing?
Yeah, it's let me back up a little bit. The goal here is that you're driving change for the future. You're not fixing the coffee machines or changing out the chairs in the cafeteria. Those are projects, right? Um, you are driving something for the future. What you want to do is put a dedicated team against that. You want to put funding around that. You want to have a strategy around that. And that was what we call a product orientation rather than a project orientation, right? So a product orientation says, what does the customer want? How do I deliver it as a product that is continuously evolving over time and getting better and better and better over time? And how do you have product teams? So when you think about product per se in your organization, you have teams that are dedicated over multiple years. They're cross-functional teams. They are funded over multiple years, and they have a set of things that they're working on, whether it's an insurance product or a banking product or a consumer goods product or a store in a retail environment. They're working in those areas over multiple years with these cross-functional teams driving it. The same thing is true of AI transformation. You have to think of the end state as a product that you're driving to. What is that end state goal that you're driving to in 3 to 5 years? And then how do you actually set up a team that attacks it in a very specific way? How do you fund that team, right? What are the goals of the team? Who are their competitors? So thinking of it from a product perspective that says, I'm going to create a team, I'm going to create collaboration in that team, and I'm going to fund it for long cycles to be able to actually deliver something, is very different from a project mindset, which is I'm going to get the project budget for the year, check, right? I'm going to get the team and the project manager for a certain period of time, check. And then it's probably going to, people are going to rotate out once that project is over. The product mindset says it's not over. You're just continuously refining and evolving because the consumer goals, the consumer demands are continuously changing.
Yeah, so this echoes where we started this conversation around the shift from sort of a 90% execution to more of a 50% innovation, 50% execution mix. And if you look at this in the startup community, right, they have the concept of product market fit, the whole standard. How do we get this match between what the market wants and what the product has? Now, more established companies don't usually have to think about that because product market fit happened years or decades ago. But when things are shifting rapidly, that's no longer the case.
It's really interesting. That's a really interesting point because, again, what the consulting firms and the talking heads would have you believe is that this new product thing is only certain people who have their safe certification or whatever the latest certification is in product management can deliver this for you. That's not the case. The skill sets that are required in product management is the skill set that every company has in their strategic planning group. It's just you have to think of it with a little twist. So strategic planning group has a 5-year plan that breaks down into annual plans and then quarterly plans. And then it's sort of a bottoms up financial planning exercise. That's the typical model. Instead of that 5-year plan for the company, you need a high level 5-year plan for the product, but then the strategic processes that you use to actually evaluate what to do next, you're talking about compressing the time cycle on that. Rather than an annual plan or 5-year plan with annual sub plans underneath it, you're actually talking about an annual plan with monthly plans and quarterly plans, and weekly plans underneath it.
Yeah.
And that's how you lay it out. So the cycle time is different. The activity is actually exactly the same. You don't need to go out and get, product management certified folks to do this work. You already do it.
So this is interesting, right? So this mistake of taking the project approach leads nicely into number 5, which is taking static strategic planning,
right? Which
is kind of what you're talking about in this traditional approach. So how would you compare that to what is static strategic planning and what change needs to happen to get it right?
Right. We call it dynamic strategic planning. No, I think the strategic planning piece is something that has to be tied into the actual execution. That's where if you had a 5-year strategic planning cycle, you couldn't really tie it into the day-to-day execution back in the day. What you have to do is you have to take your strategic planning cycle, compress it, and make it much more specific. So you have to be much more rigorous about what is the economic fact base that supports the decision making for this product team or teams. So how do you figure out what your value pools are? How do you size those value pools? And then based on those value pools, prioritize the pieces of the customer journey or the capability that you're driving with AI, right? And then you have to break those down into initiatives and then assign real economic value to those initiatives. Now you can prioritize these things. What I observe a lot of times in the project-based world is there's one time when a business case is important. It's when you're trying to get approval for the project. Mm-hmm. So it becomes this big resource gathering exercise, right? It's like, who can get all the IT resources? Who can get all the people? Because I promised something in my business case. And then nobody ever looks at the business case again. Let's step back from that. And let's say that that business case is a bit more rigorous and drives down into what value is expected to be derived from each component of the product that we're planning on taking out using our product management. And what that enables you to do, and we'll come to this later, is dynamically prioritize what you're going to be working on as new data comes to light.
So that's an interesting, the final words you said, as new data comes to light, I think is a really interesting way to frame where this leads into the next mistake, which is ineffective resource allocation, right? Because if you take this static strategic planning to its logical extreme, we put our budget, we placed our bet, and a year later, we'll see how that bet turned out. But in reality, what's happening, since everything's being compressed, we have to place more bets, and we have to have a shorter feedback loop as to when we get new signal to say, hey, this bet's doing better than we expected, we should double down. This bet's doing poorer than we expected, we should cut it sooner than we would do otherwise.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that? Like, how does that work in practice without causing a mess?
Yeah, it's a great point. So these are the types of things that people don't account for in the beginning of these types of transformation programs. So I'll give you a really good example of why a lot of transformation programs fail. It's accounting method. You wouldn't think it. You would think it's technology talent, or you would think it's business requirements are not clearly laid out, et cetera. No, it's the accounting methodology that we use, that everybody uses to implement these types of transformations. So what ends up happening, unless there's a transaction and there's a bucket to work through the transaction funding for that, if it's business as usual capital expenditure, what happens is you create a project, create a business plan for that project, and it's a multi-year thing, and you're going to do it for 3 years. You're going to spend $50 million, and then you're going to amortize that $50 million once it goes live over the next 20 years, because that's how long you expect the software asset to be good. Imagine a world where you're not just implementing SAP or Salesforce, or you're not building an office building, right? That all works in those cases because you know what the end outcome is going to be. You know exactly the steps. Imagine that you're working on a project where you're testing and learning and you're failing as you go along. If your failure is tied to a WIP on your balance sheet, you're going to have to write that off in the quarter. I don't know if that made sense. But
okay, so let me put this
up,
decision. So this basically means that you have to, when you're in this place, and it's all well and good to say we need to be able to be rapid, quick on our feet, be able to cut bets and move on. You're basically saying that now I'm forced to either ride that bet much longer than I knew. I already know it's a failure, but I have to keep riding it, or I could like tank the stock price. Like I could basically come out and say we have this massive loss because we have to write off this bet. Is that what you're saying?
That's the way our accounting systems work, is that if you make a bet, if you make a capital expenditure bet, it goes into your work in process on your balance sheet. And if you complete the project and take it live and put that asset into use, you can then amortize it. If you don't take it to conclusion and you don't put that asset to use, and you can't sell it, right, to somebody else, then you take that loss in that quarter. And that is a huge reason why these zombie projects go on for years and years and years, even though it's clear that it's not going to drive the value that originally was contemplated. So how do we change that, right? That's the key, is that we need to make sure upfront we've set up the accounting processes such that we can do dynamic prioritization of that funding. So we will try 10 things, 8 of them will fail, but we will cut them at a much earlier stage than we normally do. These 2 will succeed, but our goal was not predicated on all 10 of them succeeding. Our goal was predicated on 2 of them succeeding. So your asset that you're building, inside of that asset, you have a lot of puts and takes.
Yeah.
But that asset overall will get put into production and get amortized over a certain period of time using this CapEx model. But this requires some careful thinking, sitting down with the finance folks, sitting down with the auditors of the firm who ultimately have to sign off that, yeah, this wasn't a $2 million write-off in this quarter,
Yeah.
right? You have to sit down with the CFOs, sit down with the audit folks, and sit down with the management team and make sure that everybody understands that this is the process that we're using. And different firms have different policies on how they attack this, but it's doable. Lots of financial institutions, consumer companies, retail companies have done this, have taken this approach, and have been successful. It's just a matter of making sure that that's clear, so you don't create these zombie projects that are sucking up dollars but not providing value.
Yeah, this is really wild, right? So at a meta level, right? So the overall topic of this discussion is 10 things you can do that cause problems, right? But really, at a high level, right? Our first segue, we said governance and leadership. If you get that wrong, then you shouldn't be listening to this section already, because you've already set yourself up for failure. But wait, there's more, right? So even if you get the governance and leadership right, if you're not able to account for the portfolio of projects or products, right, that make up your AI reinvention, if you can't account for that as a portfolio, then that's another foundational problem that's going to tie your hands up, that you don't even need to hear the rest of this again. Even though your team's excited and the morale, everyone's like super excited, we're all on board with this vision, but you've got this accounting problem that's foundationally, you have no choice.
And it's not a problem. It's accounting policy.
Yeah.
Yeah. I wouldn't call it an accounting problem because it's there for a very good reason. Otherwise, people hide things on their balance sheet.
But I'm saying, but if you get this wrong, you've got a foundational problem that's going to tie your hands, and it's going to stop you from doing anything else.
And I can guarantee you, last time we talked about the company that spent hundreds of millions of dollars and still haven't delivered value to the customer. Where or could those dollars be used more effectively if you don't have these zombie projects going on because of an accounting issue?
Yeah.
Right. Where could you have freed up and gotten a lot more value? What is the process to look at those programs and products on a regular basis and trim the ones that are not going to succeed and fund the ones that are going to succeed and drive that overall AI asset forward? That's going to be the key.
And being dynamic with it and doing it in a way that's not like, taking your A players and shooting them for being on a bet that got cut, right? That
never happens.
The bet got cut because it succeeded in producing information that told you it was not a good bet and you should cut it. So there's all these different dynamic things that you're able to do if you have the right financial architecture in place, you've got the right governance in place, people are excited, and now you're moving bets a lot faster than your competition, which means you're reinventing yourself a lot faster than your competition.
Exactly.
Right? Unless, which takes us to the next mistake, right? And so now, so we've got our governance in place. We've kind of got our funding and prioritization in place. Now let's talk about execution, right? And so number 7 is misalignment between strategy and execution. So what does this mean in the context of AI, and how does this play out?
Yeah, it's really, there are literally millions of people out there to help companies execute on their AI initiatives. Like literally go into Google and type AI transformation, produces over 400 million results, right? There are 400 million people out there that would be willing to help you do your AI transformation. So clearly a lot of experts, but why are 80% of these types of initiatives all still failing, right? It's kind of puzzling. And the reason, again, the answer is not in some whiz-bang new thing that some new outside person is going to bring you. It's found in the solid management capabilities of the people that your organization probably already has, right? Let's not think about all this new ways of working, like all this stuff coming at us from the press, from the consultants, from software companies, all these disruptions, all these things coming at us. Or even our employees coming at us with, hey, I just read this article. This is what I did on ChatGPT. Why can't I do this at my job? Let's ignore that for a second and look at what's really required to create execution at scale, right? So the first thing that we were just talking about is, what is the value-driven approach to making decisions on a day-to-day basis, right? So if you have a team where you've pushed down the decision-making, what is the process they're using to decide, what am I going to work on this? Am I going to work on this? Or am I going to work on this? And in today's day and age, what should happen is you should stack rank. If you're looking at it from a product orientation, products have different capabilities and features. You stack rank the capabilities based on the greatest value that's going to be provided to the customer. And you then go work on that. And the team prioritizes based on that, based on external information, based on what the competition is doing, all those kinds of things. What happens today is you got a certain amount of capacity, whatever is on the list gets pulled in. And there's some decision-making process that is a completely fact-free decision-making process. People might vote in a room, say, hey, I want to work on this. So I think in this model, it's really critical where you've pushed these decisions down to have an execution mindset in the team that is always talking about ruthlessly prioritizing what's creating value for the customer and what's creating value for the enterprise, right? Yeah. So to do this, what they have to be able to do is quickly figure out which features the customer finds to be important, which are not. And then when it's built, when you build this correctly, the team actually steps up and takes accountability for delivering on the outcome. There doesn't have to be a top-down push on, have you done this? Have you done this? What value is this delivering? The team has total view into where the value is coming from, what they're working on, and they are proud to say that they're actually capturing the value or tell you what is preventing them from capturing the value. This is a muscle that most organizations don't have today.
Yeah, which I just think is a nice segue into our next mistake, right? Because what you're saying is that if we properly we've got our strategy, we've got our foundation in place, we've got our strategy, and we kind of now have our execution priorities in place. That can still fall flat if we make the next mistake, number 8, which is lack of empowerment and agility in teams.
Yeah, and we talked a little bit about this before, right? Is that you give the teams the decision-making authority in every case that you can, and move away from command and control structures. When people are making decisions day by day, hour by hour sometimes, on what they're going to work on and where the priorities lie, you can't control that from the top. So the decisions, the ones that can't be reversed, those have to be retained by senior leadership. Mm-hmm. But you have to put the right skill sets and the right accountability in the team that they can make the right decisions based on the customer experience, based on technology direction, based on regulatory needs. Like, who do you need to have on the team to make sure the regulatory needs are covered, right? Marketing, branding, a whole host of functions in the organization that need to be participants in that decision-making process and need to be empowered for this, right?
Yeah, I think what's really interesting about this, right? Because we're talking about execution, but not really. We're talking about something else, right? You talked about building muscle within the teams. It's not building execution muscle in the teams. If you have good people, they know how to do whatever it is they're good at. You're talking about building decision-making muscle in these teams. And by pushing these, you call them the two-way doors, those types of decisions, the more decisions that these teams are making, the better they're getting at decision-making, right? So it sounds like that's a lot of what the empowerment comes from. And then the agility becomes a side effect of them getting better at that decision-making.
That's right. And you have to, the role of senior management is to build these teams deliberately. Scope out who needs to be on this team, what their roles and responsibilities are, what partnerships do they need with the business, with the technology, with other parts of the organization, and then build that core team focused on that product very, very deliberately. That's not what happens today, right? You find the people who are available, put them together, maybe send them to a training, and then try to get them to do a project
Yeah.
and build their skills as they go along. That's not the optimal approach. The optimal approach is to get the right blend of people with the right skill sets. And sure, some people may need some training, but it's on their developmental path. They have mentors that they can count on, and build these teams deliberately so that they can execute and be successful and build the right relationships and work together, right? So
I think there's
it's
a
not,
lot. Yeah, I think there's a
yeah,
lot of interesting stuff here too, because it's sort of like you're allowing this team to be responsible for all these decisions, but then you're empowering them to be response able across each of these decisions. Meaning they learn that
100%.
if there's a decision to be made, I can respond to it. I can do it. I don't have to go up. You're kind of building that muscle and execution power.
That's right. That's right. And if you find yourself getting into their decision making all the time, then you haven't structured the team correctly. It's not the team's fault.
Yeah, and the problem is, right, so we keep talking about AI is it's not urgent, it's not going to happen immediately, but it's certainly compressing timeframes, and we need to be faster than we did before. So we need to get faster. To get faster, we need to achieve a sense of flow among our teams. And
That's right.
if they have to ask up or if they have to ask up every time they have a decision, they can't get in the zone. They can't get that speed. So you have to figure out how do we build their capability to move fast.
That's right.
Right.
That's 100% right. Yeah, it tells um, there's some really interesting stories around that, empowering the teams, right? So in the Toyota manufacturing plants, every team member has the ability to stop the line. And there's this great story. I'm probably going to mess it up. There's a great story about the Fremont plant, which I think is now a Tesla plant, but the Fremont plant where they were using American workers to build some joint venture car. And Toyota's son was visiting the plant that day, and something was going wrong on the line, and the worker was rushing to get that final piece done, but they were moving out of their designated area, and it was not working. And Toyota's son came up to the line, said, just pull the cord, stop the line. And the worker, our mindset, right, is like, we'll fix it. We're heroes, right? We
Yeah.
fix the thing, rather than trusting the process or building the team in that way. And he literally took the guy's hand and held it and pulled the cord.
Yeah.
And the guy was apologizing, and he said, it's not your fault. It's my fault that you felt that you had to do this.
Yeah.
That's management taking accountability for not structuring the team correctly, not giving them the right skill sets, right?
Yeah.
Said it's not your fault that you had to pull the cord. It's my fault.
Yeah. And so there's sort of,
You
it
felt
starts
like
with,
you couldn't pull the cord.
yeah. So it starts with empowerment and being able to have that authority to do it right. But then this kind of leads us to the next mistake that you can make, even if you have that empowerment, right? So number 9 is inefficient development processes. Right. So like, what do we do? How do we get stuff done in this product? Like everything's different now. We're working as a product team. So how does this play out? Like what kind of processes are people executing? Like why are those insufficient and how do we need to change them?
Yeah, I think the most important thing is creating this test and learn mindset. How do you create a hypothesis, empower it, inform it with data, and then go very quickly with developing in a fast-paced environment with frequent releases and then feedback loops, so you can continuously iterate in that positive direction that we talked about, rather than in the negative direction, right? So how do you do things quickly, drive feedback loops, and instrument the process so that you can drive the upward momentum? And there are a couple of different types of problems. The way to think about this is not a one size fits all type of model. Most people say agile team, I don't know, 4-week sprints, you go figure it out. The way you have to think about it is there are two types of problems. One is where the outcome is sort of unidirectional. There's one option for what the approach is going to be, and the outcome is kind of known, not totally known. That set of work needs to get done differently than a set of work where the outcome's unclear. There could be multiple approaches. You might go down this one path and go down that path for 3 months and then hit a brick wall. And you have to come back and go down the next path. So there might be multiple approaches. So the key is going to be, yes, everybody talks about iterative and agile and all of this, but the key is going to be to first triage the problems, right? And you triage them into two things. One is the complexity and the number of solution options that you have, right? And then you look at those initiatives that fall into those buckets, and one that has a single solution option might take one iteration to solve. This one over here, which has 5 solution options, may take 3 iterations to solve, or may take all 5 potentially to solve. And that's how you have to scope the problem and create this test and learn mindset in this new world. If you just say iteration, 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 iteration for every single problem, it's bound to fail because problems don't all look alike. So that triage and creating that test and learn mindset around the triage is going to be really cool.
And again, this all rolls down from the, where we started the discussion about the shift from 90% execution to 50% innovation, 50% execution, right? So the terms, if you think of the terms exploration and exploitation as two different functions that businesses have to be good at, right? Most businesses that are at steady state get really good at exploitation, and exploration becomes less important. Think of this like oil rig building, right? If you know oil is underneath this particular part of ground, you don't need very innovative people to build the rig. You need the people that are really good at building the rig. And that's going to be, to your point, there's one project plan, there's one way to do it, and you build the rig and you get the oil out. But before you know where the oil is, there could be theories, there could be ways to think about it. There's a lot of ways to explore. These are two different types of activities, and you can make mistakes in either case if you are trying to use the exploitation mindset when it's an exploration problem, you're going to get stuck trying to do these projects when you're really trying to do discovery. Likewise, AI is no different than anything else. When you hit oil, going down the let's continue to explore, you need to figure out how to shift that mindset as well and say, okay, this is something that's known. We just discovered a potential 10x outcome. We need to now shift our mindset for that particular bet into an exploitation mindset so we can start capturing value out of it while continuing to explore down other things that we don't know.
That's right. That's exactly right.
Right.
And I think that gets you to kind of the 10th big mistake is people don't have that. People don't actually think about what it takes to effectively scale once you've hit oil.
Yeah, this is exactly, so the way this would play out, right, is like I place these 10 bets, fail, 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 oil, fail, 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 fail. Keep going, let's keep going, let's keep going, as opposed to like, wait a second.
Exactly.
What about the oil thing? What do we do there?
And that small, nimble team that hit that one oil thing, they're now expected to do all of it, right? Like make the $10 billion of oil that came out of it. But that's not how it works, right?
Yeah.
You have to set up a structured process to identify where you've now hit the oil. And then you have to have that structured process to scale it up very quickly. Right. So this includes elements like launch best practices. So you've got the idea, you've proven it out. How do you launch it now on a broader scale? Right. what are the design principles that when you're going down and digging for that oil, if you do it in this way, I can't be sure that I can scale it. But if you've done it in the way that has been prescribed, the design principles that were prescribed, then we can scale it because it plugs right into the broader machine.
Yeah.
The technology platforms, the standards that are used, right? Adoption and training, having that in the box ready to go. These are the types of things that you need to have in place to actually benefit from all the 9 things that we talked about. If you fix all the 9 things and you have now this machine that can identify opportunities, getting this right is what gets you over the top.
Which
Because
is
now you
funny
can
because
scale and
yeah,
capture the
which is funny
value.
because you keep saying, and I think it's right. It's like most companies have what they need. They already have the right players, they've got the right ideas, they've got the right values, they've got the right history, they've got all the right raw ingredients, right? This
Yeah.
number 10, to make this failure is to literally ignore what you already have at your, what you're probably already really good at, right? So it's easy to look at something like AI and say, oh, it changes everything. Okay,
Right.
yes. But there's a certain point once you've de-risked that something becomes known and it's time to exploit this. And you need to be able to then split that out into a different execution model for that discovered oil, if you will, while
Yep.
continuing to look for other oil elsewhere. So keeping the nimble teams doing the nimble stuff, but keeping the execution team saying, we have an opportunity for massive advantage here.
Yep.
That's what this means. When you stumble upon one of these in your discovery, this is like an opportunity for huge competitive advantage if you take advantage of it.
Right. And the one addition I would make to that is there's a feedback loop. So this scaling mechanism needs to let the teams that are out there looking for the oil, right? The exploitation team that you called it needs to be out, needs to tell the exploration team, here are the guidelines, here are the guardrails. You cannot do X from using customer data in this way because that's not scalable. You cannot do Y with releasing HIPAA information to a third party to do the analytics because that's not scalable, right? So there are certain guardrails and guidelines and technologies that the exploration team needs to follow. And that needs to be defined upfront so that when the thing comes out, there's not another period of a year before the scaling team can
Yeah.
actually take advantage of what the exploration team has discovered.
No, I think this is a great framing and a great way to kind of to wrap things up is like because we talked in one of our previous discussions about how what's interesting about AI is like you've got opportunities to discover potential 100x ROI, 1000x
Yes.
ROI, but with an embedded million x catastrophe if you don't mitigate it. Now, it's not insurmountable to mitigate the catastrophes, to your point. And most companies already have the resources to be able to do this, but you
That's right.
have to do it right to then make sure that you can then capture the 10x, 100x value that you discovered during this exploration process. So it's really important that you put those guardrails in place when you scale so you don't blow up the company. But once you put those guardrails in place, then push the throttle and capture the value and then continue to do the exploration as well.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, to wrap it up, I think there are 2 major insights that kind of sit over all 10 of these best practices or key risks, however we want to term them. And the first one is that organizations, like you said, already have the core skills, right? This transformation is not going to be as hard as everyone makes it out to be.
Yeah.
Ultimately, you have to own and drive the change as a leader in the corporation. No consultant can just do it for you, right? You don't need thousands of consultants running around to drive the change. As seasoned leaders in the organization, you have the fundamental capabilities and skills that you need to get through the transformation. You just have to focus on redesigning these 10 patterns that we talked about,
Yeah.
right? And redesigning them with a sense of customer centricity and continuous iteration for the pieces where the outcome is not known, right? For the stuff that the outcome's known, that 50%, you just keep doing what you're doing. But this, you have to twist a little bit in terms of these 10 patterns that need to change. And then you practically guarantee the success of your initiative.
And yeah.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. By the way, I think it's interesting you put an accent on this exploration thing, because you talk about like, okay, which consultants can we come in to figure it out for us, right? Well, if you're finding oil or you're discovering gold that's like hidden somewhere, right? You have the subject matter expertise in your organization that's most likely to help put together the right treasure map to pull that off.
That's right.
If you try to outsource that, you're not going to find it. You're going to spin your wheels, but you're going to want to look like you're making progress. You're going to scale and exploit something that's not really value. If you just believe that you have this capability within your own organization, then you just have to get that exploration. You have to figure out how to like, how do we take what we already know and discover the gold that's going to happen when we have AI at our disposal.
Exactly. Exactly. And those 10 things we talked about are not 10 things that typically outside people can come in and help you address. Those 10 things are things that you have to do internally to make sure that you have those capabilities. And then the second insight is that this will take time and you can't skip steps.
Mm.
That's the key, is that there's no shortcut, right? So it might not be hard to do, but you will have to guide your organization through all the steps, right? From start to finish, this typically takes a company 3 years to get an organization going and firing on all cylinders, right? The change will appear slow in the beginning, but then typically what you'll start seeing is in year 2 and 3, it really starts speeding up.
Yeah.
And if you skip a step, what will happen is it'll look like you've got some short-term gain, but in the end, what will happen if you just follow through the 10 mistakes that people make, that sometime 18 months down the road, because you skipped a step here, you're going to run into a brick wall, and then you'll start backsliding.
Yeah.
Because you just won't be able to make progress, right? So in that backslide, not only will you lose what you gained in the short term, but it can be a lot deeper because you never built that muscle memory, right? And that buy-in inside of the organization. And that is what's going to make the change happen.
Yeah, or even worse, you've started to build cynicism, which does a pushback. And I think the metaphor for this seems to be a flywheel, right? And so flywheels have two types of inertia, right? When we're starting to push that big, heavy flywheel, it's really hard to get things moving.
That's right.
Right? And geez, and okay, then it starts to move a little bit. Now, if we stop, it slows, right? The inertia will slow the thing down, and now we're right back at square one, except we've invested all this money. But if we stick with it over the course of a few years, the inertia flips the other way. This is that compounding producing its magic. That thing's spinning. The amount of energy in your organization that you've unlocked because now we're succeeding and we're making stuff happen and we're getting competitive advantage. Now the spinning flywheel, the inertia is that thing wants to keep spinning. So it's not easy to do that. And you have to keep pushing it or it'll stop, but the payoff is worth it.
Yeah. And imagine you skipped a step, which at that point seemed not that critical because you didn't know if you were ever going to get the flywheel spinning. You forgot to requisition through finance the lubrication that's going to, lubricate the axle. Yeah, you don't feel it right away, but 6 months down the road, when that thing comes to a grinding halt because of this thing that you never expected to hit you in the face, right? There's a lot of things that you can expect to hit you in the face, but these 10 things that we talked about, you never expect those to hit you in the face. And you never get over it if you actually don't address it and don't address it in sequence.
Great. So I think this is a great place to wrap. So I think, you've got the 10 issues. And I think if you get your governance and leadership in place, which gives people the right morale, the right feeling that, yeah, this is something, the belief that we can do this as an organization, you get the right funding and prioritization in place. Literally the resources, the fuel is given in the right places to do it. And now you understand that your execution approach has to change and has to be different, but not totally different, right, than where you were before.
Right.
You get those three things in place, you can succeed at this.
Absolutely.
Great.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Great.
Great. It's been fun
Awesome.
again.
Awesome. Thanks, Raj.
Thank you.